now, if the Ottomans were present today, Gaza, the genocide would not be happening.
But Gaza was important because the idea was if Gaza falls, Aqsa falls. Some of the British activities in World War I regarding Gaza are very similar to what the Israelis are doing today. They were flattening the town with artillery in a way which was unprecedented for 1 year now. 1 year is coming up of non-stop aggression.
But sometimes I'm not sure it's real.
Yeah.
I stop and I think, is this happening? And I sometimes actually can't believe it's real.
Yeah.
I go to work and I have to pretend it's not happening.
You're looking at a child who's going through a war zone and then she's reading Quran. They don't need your dua. They're praying for themselves. The people who are oppressed are speaking to Allah Ta'ala directly. And this is why I said, look, it's time for us to be a bit more braver in upholding the truth. Because it's not just the Ummah that are being held to ransom here. The truth is being held to ransom.
Welcome to the Narrative House podcast. Today, I'm your host, Omer Hussain, and I'll be interviewing the renowned historian, Dr Yakoob Ahmed, who specializes in late Ottoman history. He's been active on the Dawah circuit for many years and has recently been interviewed on several Muslim podcasts. Today, we should be hopefully having an engaging discussion about Ottoman history, but also how it relates to Gaza. So without any further ado, I'll introduce Dr. Ahmed. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thanks for having me.
It's really exciting to meet you today, inshallah, and hopefully we can have a very, kind of in-depth discussion about
Inshallah.
Ottoman history and how it connects to the current genocide in Gaza. So one question that's always come up for me in particular, and that's maybe because I have a slightly different connection to Ottoman history because of my own family's relationship in Palestine. So when my father grew up in a small village called Qannir, which is near Haifa, he used to know of a man called Hajj Isa. And this Hajj Isa was actually an Ottoman soldier.
Right.
And he fought in Russia.
Right.
So my dad used to tell me stories of how this man used to tell the young boys of that time, stories of how he would go off with the Ottoman army, serving under them as far as Russia.
Right.
Why is Ottoman history disconnected from the Muslim Ummah today? Is it intentional? And what is the purpose behind it?
So, parts of it are intentional, for sure they are. I mean, when we had the creation of the nation states in the region after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, there is a need by the new nation states to try to some degree, distance themselves from that Ottoman past. It's strange, some nations in the region, after the collapse of the Ottomans, have an Independence Day because of their independence from decolonization projects of the British, the French, and so forth. But other nations didn't have that. And so it's strange because to some degree you're celebrating a loss, right? So let's look at the Turkish Republic as an example. The Turkish Republic is actually a reflection of the loss of the Ottoman Empire, but as a way of trying to some degree, deal with that loss. You then celebrate the emergence of the Republic. It creates this really strange sort of situation in terms of what it means to be Turkish. Now, so many nation states felt the need to distance themselves from that Ottoman past, and they had, in the early parts of their formations, creations of historical societies. The state itself, for the first time, was creating institutions where history was going to be taught, and they were going to control that national narrative. In the case of the Arab world, I mean, they had particular forms of Arab nationalism after Gamal Abdel Nasser, but even prior to that, there was this attempt to try to create a narrative of Arab success due to Ottoman failure, right? Yeah. Now, what's unique about the Arab world, if we're going to include Algeria and Libya, perhaps in Tunisia to some degree in it, is they don't have that narrative. The Algerians, the Libyans, and the Tunisians, to some degree, have a more positive impression of the Ottomans. And even in Palestine, that is the case. But in the case of Bilad al-Sham, including Jordan and Syria and then Iraq and so forth, especially after the emergence of the Ba'athist regimes and so on, something totally different emerged. So that's one. The second thing is that, unfortunately, in the West, a lot of Muslims are people of migration. And when you're a person of migration and you become first, second, third generation, for the first generation who have migrated, there are no institutions for them to be able to turn to teach them about their Islamic past and so forth, right? Yeah. Second generation now is trying to make sense of identity, of how to fit in. And there's a dislocation now from the motherland, whatever that may be. Yeah. They recognize that because of the racism, the challenges and language, and they're still attached to their parents' generation and culture. But now they're trying to be part of the new nations that they are part of. By third generation, that link has totally been broken down. So in the West, you can see that. Another issue is that modernity is very myopic across the board. People who are modern citizens generally don't take an interest in learning about the historical past. So if you were to ask people about the history of Palestine, let alone the history of the Ottoman Empire, you would see that apart from the Palestinians, many Muslims in the West and even in the non-West don't have that long memory of recognizing what's been taking place. This is why since October the 7th, we've been serving 75 years.
Yeah.
There's a reason for that.
Yeah.
Because it's not only in the Muslim mindset, it's even in the non-Muslim mentality that this memory has just disappeared in regards to that. And then it's just the loss of the Ottoman language. When you have a large language like Ottoman, Turkish, as a lingua franca, that's no longer used and it becomes like Latin. How do you access sources? How do you access resources? And so forth. So there's these multiple reasons of why it's happened.
Yeah.
It's fascinating because it's 600 years of a blind spot.
Exactly, yeah.
It's not only Ottoman history, to be honest. When you talk about the transatlantic slave trade, that was Islamic. When you talk about Andalusia, that's not part of people. And even in parts of India and China, that history is just missing.
Yeah.
But in the case of the Ottomans, why they may be unique in comparison to, is you have an assumed continuity at least of Khulafa Rashidun, Umayyad, Abbasids, Ottomans in terms of a Khilafah.
Yeah.
And the history of the Khilafah, which has been very heavily documented historically by Muslims, this is a blind spot here. And I think that's where people would look at this as a unique thing about why don't we know this?
Yeah. And do you think that's intentional in terms of that connection to Khilafah, which was only 100 years ago? And in terms of seeing the Ottomans as potentially the last force that, kind of defended Islam as a deen and, defended its Ummah. Is that disconnection important to kind of create a defeatist mentality in the Ummah today?
So I can tell you about my experience in Syria when I lived in Syria. When I was there, Ottoman buildings were hidden, right? It wasn't only Ottoman buildings, to be fair. Like the tomb of Ibn Taymiyyah was like off bounds, right? Okay. And so forth. So many of the sort of like symbols, architecture and so forth were sort of like left in ruins or hidden so that people couldn't evoke that memory in Bilad al-Sham. Now people knew, but because they would walk past those. Like the main market was called Suq al-Hamidiyya, the market of Abdul Hamid II. The parallel street was called Sharia Midhat Pasha, who was the Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire. So people knew, but you can see that the state had gone some way of trying to make sure that past was seen as decadent. Now, why is that? Is that because they were Ottomans or is that because they were a Khilafah? Because to some degree in the region, the idea of Khilafah itself is perceived as being problematic by the nation states that have emerged. So it's difficult to know whether it's both or if it's one of the two, but nonetheless, there is an active effort to make sure that history is not remembered in the same way, because the Abbasid Khilafah is a long way away and that can be remembered in some sort of like utopian framework. So I'll give you an example. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, when he was modeling himself on the minbar, he presented himself, because Raqqa is historically part of the Abbasid Khilafah, it was the center of the Abbasid Khilafah at one point. He presented himself as a Khalifa in the image of the Abbasiyin.
I remember that, yeah.
The only time he spoke about the Ottomans was Sykes and Picot. So for 600 years, in his mind or his imagination, the Ottomans are non-existent, apart from when Sykes and Picot took place and then the deconstruction of the region. Now, it could be one of two things. It could be the fact that he just has no love for the Ottomans or doesn't know anything about Ottoman history. Or it could be that he's a product, or he was a product of the Ba'athist regime in Iraq, which was part of the indoctrination process of looking at the Ottomans negatively. He didn't want to, as an Arab, then subscribe to that negative connotation of the Khilafah and then skipped it, did a time skip and went back to the Abbasids. The problem with that distance is that when your historical memory has such a large gap in terms of an idea or concept of that nature, it becomes the concept itself becomes distant to you, right? In that sense. So anyone then trying to speak of the Ottomans finds it very difficult, because there is a natural assumption by the sort of like opponents of the Ottomans in the region to suggest that we are somehow trying to beautify the Ottomans or create a nostalgia or have an Islamist agenda.
Yeah.
But that's not necessarily the case. I'm just a historian.
Mm.
And one of the things I learned just by studying it is that the Ottomans, as Muslims, did offer a lot to the region, and that they should be given their credit.
Yeah, exactly. And that leads me on to actually my next question, which is at school.
Yeah.
It was very common to learn about the major battles in World War One.
Absolutely.
You know, the Somme, Passchendaele, and other very notable battles, especially in the trenches of Europe.
Yeah.
But actually, I'm ashamed to say, I only learned about the battles of Gaza after the 7th of October.
Right.
And when I delivered a talk about it recently, the room was completely mesmerized. They never heard of it. Why is it that, you know, something as notable as the battles of Gaza in World War One are not talked about? Can you take us through them and explain the consequences they actually had on the Ummah and Palestine in particular?
Well, I think we can both go through the Battle of Gaza together. I think now that you've just mentioned that you gave a talk on it, I think you can jog my memory a bit better than what I know of it. But first of all, I have a similar experience as you, which is when I did World War One at school. The British were presented as the heroes, right? And that's an attachment to the World War II narrative. So they created this meta-narrative of World War One and Two, and the British are like these heroes in that sense. They're the antagonists in many ways in World War One. They actually do a smash and grab in the Arab world, which is not spoken about in this country. And we're not going to learn about that as kids, for sure, unless if you start to go to university and then you get access to all these works and books and so forth. I mean, even the notion of Churchill in regards to his role in the Asian subcontinent is bypassing this country as just, it happened, move on, get over it. So in that sense, it doesn't surprise me. What's even more interesting is, and you and I will both know this, is some of the British activities in World War One regarding Gaza are very similar to what the Israelis are doing today. They were flattening the town with artillery in a way which was unprecedented at the time. So people keep talking about Dresden and so forth, and they sort of like gloss over what the British were doing in the region with their air power and just absolutely flattening towns and cities in the region. And Gaza was one of them. And what's unique is that, as you know, Gaza wasn't a small strip. It was a huge landmass that L-shaped and sort of connected the Sinai to Palestine in this sense. And that was of strategic importance to both the Ottomans and the British, because the British had occupied Egypt. And initially, because there's 3 phases to this war.
That's right, yeah.
And the first twice they are defeated, is the fact that the British, the Ottomans, Jamal Pasha, who's the general of the Ottoman Empire in the region, he sees it as an offensive opportunity. So a lot of the landmass has been lost gradually in the 19th, 20th century, and they saw World War One as a possibility of a quick smash and grab and taking parts of Egypt and making it part of the Ottoman Empire. Clearly that doesn't work out, and so it becomes a battle of trenches instead, where it becomes a defensive war for them. Now, by and large, World War One is a defensive strategy for the Ottomans. They're the ones who are being invaded. They do not invade Europe or anywhere else. And the British find it very difficult to deal with that trench mentality. It's something that they found really hard to penetrate. Now, if we're going to look at today, you can see the same thing is happening with the inability to understand how to deal with this sort of like trenched way of doing warfare in the region. So there are parallels on both sides, where on the one hand, there is a particular force which is just indiscriminately bombing a particular group of people. And there is a group of people who are defending themselves in a trench-style defensive strategy. And the interesting thing, if it was to resonate with today, is how much on both sides is that part of a memory that goes back to World War One. How much of that is word of mouth, knowing your terrain, knowing the history of the area, knowing what's happened before, and so forth. But the British, they struggle in the first attempt. They struggle in the second attempt. And it's only in the third attempt. And the reason why they're successful in the third attempt is, one, is because of the Hashemite revolt that takes place, the loss of Baghdad, and the Ottoman lines being broken by propaganda more than actual military strategy. There was military strategy involved, but it was Allenby's propaganda of making the Ottomans, think twice about where they're holding the lines, that they were able to come in through the back end. In that sense, but feel free.
Yeah,
to just...
no, that was interesting because so when I researched and looked at the first battles, the March, I think in April 1917.
That's right.
It was a resounding defeat for the British. Actually,
absolutely.
And I think the British realised they had to change strategy,
absolutely,
and weaken the Ottomans because they were proving to be very formidable in terms of defending Gaza. So one interesting thing that I found out when I was in Jordan, but I only linked the two things after the 7th of October. It was several places in Jordan where the British supported the Arab revolt.
Aqaba in
so
particular.
Aqaba was one. I visited Aqaba for the first time in my life there, and I saw a masjid named after the Sharif of Mecca, which, to be honest, I never entered. I thought it was a disgrace to enter a masjid named after someone who helped destroy the Muslim world. But also I went to the north of the country, and I saw where the Ottoman railway had been bombed in Yarmouk. So there were signs of how they actually managed to weaken the Ottomans, even in Jordan, which then had a effect.
It had a domino effect.
Exactly.
You know what's unique about that point you put forward is two things. The first is how the Hashemite revolt in particular, and I'm calling it a Hashemite revolt particularly, or the Sharif Hussain revolt, because I think the word Arab revolt is unfair. It's across the board, and it's not actually reflective of what happened. It sort of creates that back-end corridor of weakening the Ottoman defenses. That's one.
Yeah.
But the second thing is people don't appreciate, as a lot of the soldiers who are fighting on the Gaza war front were actually war heroes of Gallipoli. So they had come from what in Turkey they call Çanakkale, and the Gallipoli war is really important in Turkish historiography because it's seen as a victory moment in when Mustafa Kemal is ushering the forces to defeat the British. Why Gaza and Gallipoli become important is because in the Muslim mentality, World War I is perceived as an absolute whitewash. It's just like the Ottomans were trounced. But here you actually see that somebody who studies the history properly, that the pendulum is backwards and forwards continuously. It's like watching a football match and really not knowing who's going to win. Now we have the vantage point of knowing the outcome. So now we made the case. But at the time, the idea that the Ottomans were going to be totally trounced in World War I is not necessarily true. And why that is also a magnificent feat is because the Muslim populations in the Ottoman domains could not compete with the level of infantry that the British could pull from the various parts of the world. So, for example, in both Gallipoli and in Gaza, the infantry are from Australia and New Zealand.
Okay.
And what's interesting here is the British are using air force, they're using tanks, and they're using camels and horses, right, in the desert, which is bizarre for people to understand that camels and horses were still being used because of the nature of the terrain in that sense. And so you have these like 3 different ways of warfare coming together, tradition, 19th century, 20th century sort of activities, and then you've got the Hashemite revolts that are happening. And for the Ottomans, Gaza becomes a really difficult area to support, but Gaza was important just like today, because the idea was if Gaza falls, Aqsa falls.
Exactly.
This was very clear in their minds, right?
Clear, yeah.
And this is even today.
Yeah.
This is even today when you're listening to the Gazans, they are telling us, we are not listening. They're saying if Gaza falls, Aqsa falls, right? In this sense. And it's because there was a particular unique type of resistance in that space at the time. And in that sense, it's just, subhanAllah, it's amazing. Like I said to you before, how much of that is still an ingrained memory in the people of the space. Yeah.
No, it's really interesting. And I think one other aspect that kind of links to this a little bit is, after the 7th of October, we heard many khutbahs and many talks about the, tragic events, the genocide that was taking place in Gaza.
Yeah.
One khutbah that stuck in my mind was talking about how if the Ottomans were present today, Gaza, the genocide would not be happening. What do you think about that statement?
So there's 2 ways of looking at this. If the question is if the Ottoman Khilafah existed today, for sure, there would be no Israeli state. So that would never happen, right? And you and I have studied this part of World War I where you can clearly see that for the Ottomans, losing any part of territory was problematic. So they would have defended that until they were unable to defend it. So any form of outside aggression, clearly we can see in the case of the Ottoman Empire, that Gaza would have been part of their calculation of needed to be defended until it could not be defended anymore. It'd have to be a military defeat in that sense. So that's the case. Now, if people are making the argument, for example, let's just say the Ottoman Empire today is Turkey and Gaza is a faraway land, would the Ottomans intervene?
That's what I'm more interested in, actually.
In trying to support it. Now, what's interesting here is if we span over the 600 years of Ottoman history, we can clearly see, and this is, I think, part of the problem of how people conflate Ottoman studies. Firstly, they don't take into consideration is, would you ask that question about the Abbasids or the Umayyad? They don't do that. The Ottomans are the ones who get this special treatment. They won't say, would the Abbasids have defended them? And because we know about the Crusaders, the Mongol invasions and so on, right? But let's just take the Ottomans for... So I deliberately wanted to make that point just to make it a bit more complicated. The second thing is that each sultan in of himself has his own agency. So there's an assumption that the Ottomans had one policy over 600 years. Why am I saying that? Because people will argue, they do this. They'll say, well, what about when Andalusia happened? What did the Ottomans do? And what about the transatlantic slave trade? What did the Ottomans do? And what about when India was colonized? What did the Ottomans do? And so forth. And on each given point, I could explain why the Ottomans probably had challenges. But if we're looking at the late Ottoman Empire, and this is probably why we're thinking this way, the empire of the Tanzimat period or Abdulhamid II or even the Young Turks, there's no doubt in my mind that the Ottomans would have intervened to try to do something, because we see this in the case of Libya and we see this in the case of the Balkans. Also, I think this is something that's not taken into consideration by people, that in the Ottoman mindset, Makkah, Medina, Aqsa has a unique quality in regards to it being an Aqidah issue.
Okay.
So in that sense, they probably would have been compelled to do something because their state, nonetheless, was built on a different ethos and idea and Aqidah, you could say, than the modern nation state. My guess would be, and I'm speculating, of course, it don't exist, my guess would be that on the issue of Gaza, I think they would have intervened. On the issue of, let's just say, another ethnic cleansing or genocide taking place in other parts of the Muslim world, they may not have. If we're using the 19th, 20th century state as an example, because they may have used other means to try to support those challenges that people were facing, perhaps.
So that's really interesting. There's 2 points I want to pick up on. One was about the comparison with the Abbasids, the Umayyads, and other potential, dynasties that kind of took the seat of Khilafah in the Muslim world. And the fact that they may have had, there's also different periods in their history. So there's a period when Abbasids are extremely powerful.
Absolutely.
And the example of Al-Mu'tasim, and he would send an army.
Right.
And then other examples where they completely are almost annihilated.
Yeah.
So I guess there are different periods, and even with Ottoman history. So actually, I think that's an important point to make, that we're not talking about one unique history that spanned the whole time from the creation of Medina all the way through to the final stages of the Ottoman state. So I think that's a very important
And I'll tell you
point.
why that's important, sorry to interrupt you. Because when people always say this, the Ottomans, and this is 600 years here. And so when I talk about that myopia, right, it's condensed to the point that people are not appreciating. This is 600 years. But my assumption is that we're not talking about Fatih or Selim I. We're talking about Abdulhamid II. This is my assumption when people are often speaking about, or the Young Turks. My guess would be that both the Young Turks and Abdulhamid II would have stepped in. That was their sphere of influence. And like I said, their state was predicated on the idea of protecting the Holy Lands and the Muslim in their sphere of influence. For example, when the Crimea was lost in 1774, and when Bosnia was lost later in 1908, 1909, when they were annexed by Russia in the case of the Crimea and the Austrians in regards to Bosnia, the Ottomans had to abandon those places, but they did provide logistics and support and all sorts to try to give the people the assistance. An example, in Libya in 1911, when the Ottomans had to leave Libya, they left behind weapons and taught them guerrilla tactics and so forth. So when we're looking at Mukhtar, for example, what people don't appreciate is the Ottomans were the first to teach guerrilla warfare in Libya against the Italians. They had to leave because there was a war in the Balkans in 1912 and they had to make a choice between Libya and the Balkans, right?
I see.
So it tells you that even at their weakest point, that in the region at least, they continuously found ways of supporting resistance. And you would say that they, if they would have probably supported the resistance in some shape or form.
That's actually a really fascinating point, because I never knew that about Omar Mukhtar, and because he's always seen as kind of like a separate figure who led the resistance, not that there was potentially support from
so the
historical...
The Ottomans snuck in 1911, so basically when Italy invaded Libya. So the British were quite unique in the way that they invaded. They always created reasons for invasion. The Italians never created any reason. They just invaded, which was a shock to the system. So one of the challenges the Ottomans had was that Egypt was under the control of the British. How do you get to Libya? They smuggled their way into Libya in various ways, and they smuggled weapons into Libya, and they used guerrilla tactics that the Italians had not seen, and the Italians were fundamentally struggling with. And it was only after the Italians had convinced, I think it was the King of Macedonia perhaps, to start some form of rebellion, and then the war in the Balkans happened, that then resources were finite, and so you had to make a choice. But even in making that choice, they left behind, like I said, weapons, and they told people that
it wasn't like an abandonment of
no,
the
absolutely.
cause. It was literally being stretched to the point they could no longer defend all their
territory. And the Libyans
territory.
understood it. This was the interesting thing here. This is why I'm saying Libya's understanding of the Ottoman past is very different than, let's say, Egypt or Syria. And what's interesting is the Libyans understood it. Now, in our imaginations, the reason why Omar Mukhtar is such a hero, in fairness, is because we watched the movie, The Lion of the Desert.
Of course.
That's the problem here. It's not a gap in the memory of Libyans. It's in the gap of us, because we watched the movie, which was, by the same director who did The Message.
Yeah.
So that's where it comes from, right, in that sense.
Yeah.
But no, I'm not saying that the locals didn't understand their terrain. In fact, I would argue that without the local support, the Ottomans, in terms of their guerrilla tactics, wouldn't have been as successful, right? So the point I'm making here is that both the locals and the Ottomans understood what was at stake here.
Yeah.
And, there's a reciprocal relationship that breaks down because of the nature of what happens in World War I. And this is also important because in history, we are taught that World War I begins in 1914. Not for the Ottomans. It starts at Libya in 1911.
Okay.
So it's Libya, then the Balkans, and World War One.
Yeah.
It's
a completely different history, isn't it? When you think about it, we are given a very condensed, very specific history that's Eurocentric.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So really, important point here that you've said the Ottomans, while they couldn't defend these territories or even potentially Gaza today, if they were in their very weak state, they would still see a responsibility towards that land.
Absolutely.
And that's very much linked to the Aqidah.
Yeah, that's right.
So when people talk about the current regimes who've kind of abandoned the cause, what people tend to do is like to look at it as very black and white. Yeah. You either do a full-scale, defend it, with all your might, or do nothing at all. In fact, aid the oppressor,
that's right.
Through trade and other things. Yeah. And I think that's sometimes missed.
Yeah.
We're not even doing the bare minimum. They're actually supporting the aggressor.
I think here, my personal opinion is this is where October the 7th has really exposed us as a global ummah. Leadership for sure. And now look, there are going to be people who are going to find excuses for their leadership in any shape or form. They'll say, but we're doing this, we're doing that, whatever. Whatever you're doing is not good enough. This is the reality. So even the bare minimum is insufficient here. Why? Because this is a unique atrocity, which is a genocide taking place, where people are being obliterated for 1 year now. 1 year is coming up of non-stop aggression. Yeah. And the argument that there was no strategy possible to try to curtail or circumvent this, or to slow it down, or to restrict it in any capacity, I don't think is, for me, looking at the situation, a viable excuse. I personally feel even if a state made the argument that we're not strong enough to compete with the United States of America, or the Israelis in the region, we don't want war, we don't want further chaos and so forth. You would have to ask yourself, okay, fine, but this aggression is so one-sided, and this aggression is so egregious, and this aggression is even challenging international law from their perspective, that surely you could have come together and found a way of stopping this.
Yeah.
So you would have to say that you didn't have enough of a will or a desire to want to stop it. Yeah. I can't find another type of vocabulary for that, unfortunately, right?
No, absolutely.
Because for all the nations in the region who have their hands tied behind their back, all we're asking from you, I guess, is an effort. And at the moment, even that effort is non-existent. So any excuse they're putting on the table it's just going on deaf ears. And I'm sorry, but I can't take that.
I think I saw a talk that you gave, and you started by saying, like making a dua, that Allah count those who could have done more and didn't.
Yes.
And I think that point is sometimes missed, that it's what have they done? I mean, if on one hand you've got the UAE trading, normalizing, Egypt increasing its trade, Jordan increasing its trade.
Absolutely.
A situation where they're actually supporting the West. They're not taking any economic measures, no blockades, nothing at all.
Absolutely.
I mean, not even, mere condemnation, just very meaningless condemnation is the most we hear.
Well, even if they succeed today, let's just say that finally they wake up tomorrow and they collectively decide that we're going to put an end to this. It's too late. Like, you got to understand the level of trauma that people have been put through to get to this point. And it's a very difficult thing to live with in my consciousness as a Muslim.
Yeah.
And I find it very difficult to forgive myself. So I'm not going to forgive anyone else. Yeah. And I've had people say to me things like, we're praying for the people of Gaza and like there's not more we can do. I said, they don't need your dua. They're praying for themselves. The people who are oppressed are speaking to Allah Ta'ala directly. They don't need you. What they need from you is another way of trying to provide a solution-orientated future. Now, clearly what's evident here, and I think people are not brave enough to think outside the box, is that everything we've tried is not working. So we might have to be just brave enough and say we need to try something else. And that's where I had said in a previous podcast, I think Muslim thinkers need to be a bit more intellectually brave in terms of being solution orientated, because clearly the status quo, your fundraisings, your dinners, the charities, the dua, the telephone ring-ins, the critique of the regimes and so forth, none of this is working. So what's the practical solution here? And so that really needs a rethink. And I think this might sound harsh, but I think if we want any sense of sort of like forgiveness from Allah Ta'ala and the people of Gaza, I think collectively as an ummah, we're going to have to go through a deep level of introspection, collective introspection, and really be honest with ourselves that we have collectively failed. And that until we go through that collective introspection of recognizing we failed, and that do we have a say in terms of protecting the people of Gaza? Because I think the problem in Gaza is also a reflection of the sickness in the Ummah. The issue of the people of Gaza is the extremity, but the helplessness is collective. And I don't know if that's good enough, personally. I just don't know. So for me, I lived through many things in the region, including the Arab Spring. I had many friends from Syria and so forth that went. But this feels very different. And I think we should collectively at least take stock and say, okay, what ideas do we have on the table?
Exactly. This hasn't been a single failure. Syria for several years, and the numbers massacred there were unbelievable, in the hundreds of thousands, millions displaced. Iraq. So, but I think one thing that I always say feels very different about Gaza, it's such a small strip of land.
Absolutely.
And it's being so viciously bombarded and destroyed that I don't think we've seen anything on that scale of destruction, i.e. proportional destruction. So 80% of all homes are now, all structures I believe are destroyed now.
Every day.
Yeah, every day. I just read on my way here that several families were attacked in a Buruji camp and they were wiped off the civil register, just completely all killed. Sons, daughters, father, all of them, everyone in that family is dead now.
And everybody knows what's happening. Nobody can say they don't know what's happening.
It's streamed to our phones every minute.
We know.
Yeah.
Like, we know what's happening. Even those who are supporting it knows what's happening.
Yeah.
And like this is just not okay. So.
And there's one interesting point you said, it's almost you have to account yourself. Am I doing enough?
Absolutely.
And my real worry is when people think they're doing enough when they're clearly not doing anywhere near enough.
Absolutely.
So in Jordan, I came across a lot of people who said, I'm doing the boycotting, I'm giving charity, and I'm making dua. It all became like the three actions that have been told to of them to do. And I heard it in the masajid, I heard it from family members, and they've restricted themselves, as you said, to a complete lack of solutions. And the people of Gaza, I've heard many actually say, we don't want your money. We don't want your food.
Absolutely.
We don't want your dua even. As you said, they've actually said those words because they're saying, we need you. We need people to come and rescue us.
I remember watching a Turkish TV show, and somebody said along the lines of like to somebody from Gaza that we pray to Allah Ta'ala that He protects you. And the brother from Gaza said, and I pray to Allah Ta'ala that He gives you hidayah. So you can clearly see here. And in that level of exposure is clear for all of us to see. So in that sense, we've really got to ask ourselves, how have we got ourselves stuck in this rut, right? It's very easy to talk about Ottoman decline, right? And that's what people will do. They'll go back and say the Ottomans decline and so forth. I say, listen, look, take it easy. You need to take a long, hard look at yourself at the moment, because where we're at the moment, like, what is that in terms of this cycle you're looking at? Where are we at right now? Because this is unacceptable. And for me, I think we need to ask ourselves some very difficult questions, perhaps.
What are those difficult questions? What are those kind of thinking out the box solutions that you're referring to?
Well, I think some sort of political alternative needs to be provided here. And clearly, okay, what we're looking in the region is a weakness, perhaps. But what is that weakness predicated on? Is there a weakness because the physical infrastructures of the states don't have the capacity to do something? Or is there something more ideologically contaminated, perhaps? It's interesting. If you look at the Israeli state, it's a strange paradox in the region. Why? If the Israeli project as an ideological project collapses, it really puts into question the creation of the other nation states that came out of, the crayons that Sykes and Picot used. In that sense, that project's failure highlights or exposes all the other states in the region in terms of their projects, because they never fashioned them in the first place. That really puts the idea of the nation state under a tremendous spotlight. So the question is, and Muslims have been saying this for a while, is that what's next? And the idea of going beyond the nation state, it's not just simply attacking the nation state for the sake of it. It's the fact that throughout history, every political entity has gone through a collapse moment. The assumption, the very modern assumption that the nation state is the best idea known to humanity, is just clearly not true. And the notion that it's going to be around forever is also clearly not true. So surely we should be thinking of a far more pluralistic way of thinking, which is far more inclusive for Muslims around the world, and trying to fashion a different way of thinking, perhaps, that is not just rigid in terms of we're just going to hold the fort in terms of what we have. There is nothing civilizationally that we offer to the world. And that's where the Ottomans are different. That's where the Umayyads are different. Civilizationally, they were offering Islam as something on the table. Right now, that's just left to individual dais and YouTube channels and imams and so forth. On a political perspective, that is not a position that's offered. And I think that is something that if our nation states offered, perhaps, then that would be interesting. But they don't even do that.
And the interesting thing I always say to people about Palestine, I'm always cautious how I say this in public because the Zionists love to jump on this point. But I say Palestine was never a country in the sense that you imagine it was a country. It was actually, to the exception in the Arab world, it was occupied colonially by the British and then handed over to what would become essentially the Zionist entity. It never had this kind of truly independent state that we see in, say, Jordan, Syria and other places. So they never actually see themselves in the same way as maybe some of the other Arab countries.
Well, what's unique here is that in Islam, so I always recite Surah Deen, وَالتِّينِ وَالزَّيْتُونِ وَطُورِ سِينِينَ وَهَٰذَا الْبَلَدِ الْأَمِينِ. Why? Because in that surah, Allah Ta'ala is making the case of Islam being integrationalist, right? It integrated Bayt al-Maqdis within the framing of Makkah and Medina and so forth, right? Allah Ta'ala has made it very clear that in terms of Muslims, this is what we do. We integrate things and make it equal in terms of its sacred space. Especially in regards to Palestine, it was integrated. This is why, even today, Egyptians are hurting in regards to Gaza, because historically Gaza has been part of the imagination of the people in that region. Palestine was integrated with Bilad al-Sham. It was part of the whole remit in that sense. And people from Haifa would marry people from Damascus, and people from Gaza would easily go down to the Sinai, and people in Jordan, which even today is probably 60% Palestinian anyway. Like, this was a very integrated space. To isolate Palestine in that way, because there are some activists who make the case that this is a Palestinian issue, is to detract from the Ummah's capacity to be able to feel a sense of affiliation to the subject area by making the case that we have nothing to say here, and that if we do say something from an Islamic perspective, we are actually hurting the chances of the Palestinians. What the problem is that it's taken away that integrationist mindset that the region always had, and the Israeli state is the anomaly which has disrupted that.
Yeah.
Right? It's a foreign entity that's come in the region and totally deconstructed the attachments that all of these people had to each other.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic
Right?
point. Yeah.
So for me, when I'm talking about the Ottoman period here, I'm not talking about the Ottoman government in Istanbul. I'm talking that this region during the Ottoman period, which was self-governing itself to some degree, the peoples were integrated in a way, from the ulama to the networks to the food to marriages and so forth, in a way that people were inseparable. And that, I think, should be part of the imagination locally anyway.
Yeah. And I'm just on a personal note, just to give you an idea of how integrated that was. So my great-grandmother from my mum's side, her name is Fatima Agha, and she came from Turkey.
Okay.
She married a Palestinian man.
Mashallah.
From my dad's side, just a couple of generations back, they're from Mansouriya in Egypt.
Right.
And they came, it was a melting pot.
Yeah.
And it was like you wouldn't view someone saying to you, I live in London and Newcastle, there's two different things. You view it as one nation. That one nation spanned way further than Palestine.
Yeah,
it encompassed actually Arab and non-Arab speaking lands.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I always make the point, the Muslim world has been connected by what you would call major cities that created constellations, right? And there was a particular cosmology of the Muslim world which made it very elastic in the way that it moved. But one of the things that are consistent is that centers were connected to other centers. And this is what made the Muslim world unique, that people would be from one center and move into another center and be connected to another center, an Uber center perhaps. In that sense, when I lived in Syria, for example, I had students who were called Arnaout, a surname, and Albani. Clearly, when we looked at them, we knew they were Albanians, right? Yeah. We had students, like you said, whose surnames were Pasha. We knew that they were from Turkey at one point in their life. I have a friend from Syria whose family lineage are from Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi. So people were from all over. People in the region still know it. Yeah. So this is why sometimes you get people saying, she's Palestinian, but her name's Al-Masri. Like, how is that possible? Yeah. Well, actually, there's not a contradiction at all.
Not at all. Right.
So this is an imagination that I think is important.
Yeah.
Not to simply see the Syrian struggle, the Palestinian struggle, in isolation from one another, or the Iraqi struggle, but trying to look at the way of how the Muslim world and Islam as a civilizational sort of like worldview creates a particular connectivity and integration rather than trying to create agitation and so on.
And that seems to be their main tool, as you say, is the nation state, and kind of putting all your heart and love behind that. So the flag, the anthem, the land. And it's incredible because when you think of like a country like Jordan, it was completely inseparable from Palestine, because that whole Sham region was kind of under one Ottoman kind of district, and they had sub areas. And I was amazed that even the north of Palestine used to be called Urdun.
Yeah, that's right.
It was actually Jordan, because that's how it was distributed, kind of managed by the Ottomans.
And they just administered it in forms of hierarchies of, in terms of tax administration and things like that. But I mean, look, for example, how did the British even draw up Sykes-Picot with the French? Like, how did that happen, right, in that sense? So in the past, I mean, there's a Turkish movie, I forget its name now. I remember watching a very long time ago, where when the Turkish border was drawn, there was like these people who were in the north of the border who could no longer see their relatives in the south of the border. And there was this like confusion, like what's going on, right? Because that's what these borders actually did. They separated people from peoples. And then there was these huge efforts to try to create new memories for people, new identities, new ways of looking at themselves and having a self-reflection, and new ways of loyalty towards the government, the flags, the symbology, and so on, right? To some degree, you'd have to say that they weren't that successful, because the fact that you and I are having this conversation is not something that people are not having at the dinner table. Although the intelligentsia in the region may take exception to this conversation, perhaps. But the reality on the ground, I don't think even they can deny it.
There's definitely that clash. There's that idea being propagated that actually is this model the right model for the Muslim world? But they're holding on to it with dear life because they need to fight for it. I think they know this is the only way to keep the Ottoman in this current predicament.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is that the way to maintain that has been outside intervention continuously. 1 million people were killed in Iraq, right? They dropped the mother of all bombs on Afghanistan. Like, if this is the only way that they can sustain it. And it's sad because what upsets me is that we've literally become cannon fodder for everybody, right? My whole life, I can't ever remember a time where Muslims are not being flattered by one government or another.
I think you're absolutely right. It's just constant, isn't it? It has not stopped.
And it's emotionally exhausting. Because what people don't appreciate perhaps is that as a Muslim, your whole life, there's an exhaustion in the sense of continuously being stressed out about a people that belong to you as a body who are just continuously under the pump. And that's not easy to take.
So that leads me on to my next question. As many people know, Sean King embraced Islam at the beginning of Ramadan. I think the first night of Ramadan.
He was in Istanbul.
Was it in Istanbul?
No, I don't know.
He came to Istanbul. Yes.
After that.
That's what I was going to ask you about that, actually.
Yeah.
So, I mean, subhanAllah, this is one of the, I think you mentioned this as well, Gaza gives hope, but also kind of despair at the same time. Right. Despair at the fact that we can't stop the slaughter. And sometimes it feels unbelievable. I met a brother from Gaza on Jum'ah. He's from northern Gaza, and you can imagine the situation there. And he goes, sometimes I'm not sure it's real. I stop and I think, I have to just think in a little room by myself, is this happening? And I sometimes actually can't believe it's real. I go to work and I have to pretend it's not happening. Because I know when I get out of work, I'll go through the messages and they would have inevitably been more massacres and more children orphaned and more children killed. And the world is watching it. So it really does feel sometimes unbelievable that the situation is still occurring, almost as you say, year in. But one thing that Sean King said in Istanbul that I think really hit me, he did a couple of videos there that were very powerful. One was in, what's it called? Hagia Sophia. And he was talking about how we as an Ummah have to do more. But another one he did was in the Topkapi Palace, where he looked at the swords of the great Sahaba. And I think Rasulullah's sword is there as well. And he goes, we are the descendants of warriors. And what's happening is just unacceptable. We're not fulfilling that duty. What would you say about that in terms of what's happening now? And as an Ummah, what could be done more? Is it just something for us that when people go and visit the Topkapi and then visit the Hagia Sophia, it's very much a romanticized feeling, we love the masajid, love the architecture, but are we really taking the real lessons from these examples?
The nostalgia is for what?
Yeah.
If we're here in London, if somebody attacks your family, the nostalgia is for what? If somebody ransacks a masjid, the nostalgia is for what? What's the point? But, just forget that and then say, you know what, I'm going to go to Topkapi Palace and we were great at one time. It tells you something that put Islam to aside for a second. It's a very human condition and value that people should be strong enough and brave enough to be able to safeguard themselves, their families, their people, and the values that they stand for. Every society and community should have the right to do that. And in that sense, we are no different. And so right now, the idea that Muslims are just choosing to continuously be pounded by, bombs from all sorts of countries and nations, and we are told to just go to a demo on a Saturday and bring out your flag, and that's enough. It's not enough. So what it requires, like I said to you before, is ideas, is solutions, uncomfortable conversations perhaps in the community. And we can argue till the cows come home, but fine, we need to put those ideas out there. And it also requires people who are brave enough, strong enough to let people know that this community is not a community of fools, that we're not going to be taken as being weak. And our inactivity, collective inactivity, has shown a collective weakness, perhaps. And so the fact, look, the Israelis calculated that we're going to do this and the Muslims won't do anything. It was part of their calculation. They calculated it. They weren't wrong in that calculation, unfortunately. Now, Muslims will turn around and say, what can we do? And so forth. And we've done the Arab Spring and we've gone through this violence. Do you want more violence? And so forth and so on. Okay, so let's just sit at home and watch YouTube videos every day. That's not the way forward.
Yeah.
You're going to have to, on the one hand, like I said, have ideas, but on the other hand, really create a generation of Muslims who are not cowardly. And so we have to ask ourselves then, have we become cowardly as a collective?
Yeah.
If that's the case, are you going to be satisfied with your children being the same way? My argument to that would be that that's not acceptable.
Yeah, and I think that's actually something that Sean has said many times. We've become cowards.
Well, the younger generation are amazing.
Yeah.
Because I'm seeing a bravery in them that I'm not seeing in us. They're the ones who are going out. And look, I've spoken to a lot of young kids who are seeing what's happening on social media. And you can see they want guidance from people like us. And we're not giving them guidance. We're just telling them, just keep your mouth shut and we'll just keep moving on. That's unacceptable as far as I'm concerned. We should be giving them, firstly, we should be sitting down with children and explain to them clearly what's taking place here, because it's not easy. It's not normal for them to be seeing this stuff. I had one child say to me, on the one hand, I can't take it. But on the other hand, when I don't watch it, I feel like I don't care. Now, and she was smart enough to even say to me, I know that this is a 24/7 for the people of Gaza and I can switch my phone off. But should I keep watching this? Right? Now, this requires an honest conversation by parents to their kids to help them through this. But at the same time, don't take away the bravery that your kids have. Allow them to maintain that, because the strange thing about Gaza is, we've both spoken about, on the one hand, it does create a sense of despair. But on the other hand, you can't help but think, not just us as Muslims, but even non-Muslims are looking at the Gazans' absolute bravery, standing up tall and giving an account for Islam in the way that we have failed at.
Yeah.
And I think in that sense, that tells you something.
Yeah. I mean, I think that point about being the defenders of Islam, they've made that point themselves.
Absolutely.
We're defending Gaza on behalf of this Ummah. We're defending Al-Aqsa on behalf of this Ummah. And people forget that. They think it's, a Palestinian struggle. And that's why I hate it when it's kind of portrayed in that way, where it's kind of a nation struggle, a nation state kind of struggle, where we need to be, admitted to the UN. But actually, this is a struggle of the Ummah that's being kind of abandoned at the moment. I mean, they took back the body, repatriated the body of Maher al-Jazi, who was known to have undertaken an operation against Israelis, and there was, I think they held on to the body for a week. I just saw the funeral procession. It was absolutely huge. People from Ma'an in Jordan, and many people said he wasn't doing this for Jordan. He was doing this for the Palestinians. He saw them being obliterated and he said, I couldn't be silent any longer. But those who seem to have the capability are not doing that.
Absolutely.
So those uncomfortable discussions, I think, I know what you mean. I think a lot of the time people want to settle for what's easy. Let's raise some money, let's make some dua, let's boycott, because no one's going to disagree with those things.
That's right.
Israel's a pariah state. It's all comfortable language. But when then you start questioning, why are we in this situation? Is it right for another Muslim nation to abandon the people of Gaza? Then it becomes a bit more uncomfortable.
Well, I remember when Syria happened, I had a Syrian student who was very frustrated in Turkey. And he said to me, I'm just going to tell Allah what you did. And I remember just didn't know what to say. I mean, he didn't mean me. He meant us. Because I'm just going to tell Allah what you guys did. And what do you say to that? Now, in history, we would have had many of these moments. And Allah will hold those people accountable. And I think that we too are going to be held accountable. It's only for Allah Ta'ala to see fit how He wants to deal with us. But the interesting thing is that whenever we've gone through these moments in Islamic history, there have been people, like I said, who have put out ideas that have then they've resonated with future generations where people can run with it, right? And I think this is where this is important. That the issue of Gaza is not just about the now. It's about clearly understanding the future. That this is not just about 1 year, 5 years, the day after. This is about clearly understanding the future of the Ummah, by and large, the idea of Islam and how it makes sense for us, by and large, and being future orientated in that sense, and clearly thinking in that way.
And that's interesting you said that, because I think there was phases in how people responded to Gaza. It's almost like a trauma that we're still trying to process. But in the initial phase, I felt like people wanted to do anything they could, and there was a desperation. But then those who kind of reflected and thought about it a little bit more realized the predicament that we're in. This isn't going to be solved by some kind of just immediate response to Gaza. this is chronic.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've hit a chronic problem, and now we've realized how bad it is. Maybe all the symptoms until now were bad, but this is almost like it's going to kill us if we don't respond.
Well, I think it's killing us anyway.
It's killing us.
Look,
Yeah.
I'll tell you something now. The West, which is heavily interconnected with the Muslim world in many ways, I don't think we've escaped that colonial yoke. It means that any sickness that we are suffering, they are also suffering. The difference is that we don't want to be suffering from this sickness, and they're denying they're sick, right, in that sense. So this sickness that humanity is going through, in this sense, it has far-reaching implications. Then the solution is not just for Muslims, in fact. The solution is that civilizationally, ideologically, what you have posited, which is the possibility that you can try to obliterate people and just move on with your lives, shows you that you are also sick.
Yeah.
That means that they're not going to escape that sickness either. And once you recognize that, I'll tell you why. Because in the Quran, there are numerous ayahs in the Quran of Allah Ta'ala talking about when a people have lost their moral compass, when a people, there's going to be an allotted time for them, when a people, Allah Ta'ala will deal with them in this life and the next. And in this life, it means that the course of nature will take its course. There is no way you can see longevity from this. I'm telling you this as a historian, right? That this is not sustainable. That's why I'm saying you have to be future orientated, that if this is not sustainable, if we can see it and they can see it, if everybody can see it, it's not just the problem now of Muslims thinking, we'll just close our eyes and it'll go away. The West is doing the same. It's not going to go away. It's going to create a humongous set of fissures.
Yeah.
And so it's not only going to destabilize states and nations, but human beings themselves. This is where Islam still offers respite. And in that sense, once again, our thinkers then need to take this into consideration, that this is inevitable. It's not a matter of if, it's just when. How that will be when. How long that will be, I don't know. That's why I'm saying, let's start producing ideas that can be salvational for everybody.
I think that's crucial, isn't it? This isn't about Muslim Ummah alone. This is about humanity. And
Absolutely.
it makes you think of those examples, but they're examples of history, not for us to just read as stories. I think you said this. It should be like a narrative. We should be taking this as an example of how to lead our lives for the future. When you think about Umar Khattab and how he entered Jerusalem, when you think about the Ottomans and how they kind of managed the state and the fusing together people of different faiths, it was a model in terms of, compared to what we see today, it's absolutely revolutionary, really.
Well, look, one of the reasons why I love history is because Muhammad Iqbal, when he makes the case of history in the Quran, he says that there's two ayats in the Quran, history and nature, right? Now, what's intriguing when he mentions these two, he makes the case that they're both contemplative. You have to contemplate over things in nature. Allah Ta'ala is asking you. And even in the Quran, he's asking you to contemplate over issues that happen in the historical past. So one of the things about Islamic history is that it's not addressing the thinking person, it's addressing the contemplative person. There's a difference between the one who thinks and the one who becomes contemplative. Islam continuously in the Quran is very clear here on trying to, the ideas of each ayat is to make you contemplative. When I'm on these podcasts, very rarely are people asking questions or thinking about history in a contemplative manner. It's simply, can you answer these questions? What happened here? Is this? But what I'm saying is, look, the way that we do history is that we're trying to contemplate in terms of understanding the plan of Allah Ta'ala, the rahmah of Allah Ta'ala, the morals and ethics in Islam and so forth, right? In this sense, the reason why I can so conclusively talk about the sickness that exists in humanity today is because as a historian looking meta, I've seen it happen on so many occasions, right? And then you step back and you go, okay, right, we're in a bit of a situation here. And it's that contemplation, that the difference between being a knowledge seeker and a person of hikmah, wisdom, is the key here. And I think this is what I'm trying to encourage in the way that we do history, that we should be contemplating about what can we take from this in that sense.
Yeah, I think this is vital. Maybe we can explore some of those points in the final few questions. I mean, one thing that shocked me a little bit in, I guess, Turkey, the first time I went with it was a couple of years ago, Turkish nationalism is extremely
Yeah.
apparent still. And in the Arab world, I've still seen that. But in comparison to where we were 100 years ago, because we're literally in the 100-year anniversary of
that's
the kind of destruction of the last Ottoman Khilafah,
Mm.
where are we now? Has there been an awakening? Is there an improvement? Are we moving away from some of those thoughts and ideas?
I think we've gone through peaks and troughs, actually, ups and downs. But I'm personally not convinced on the strength of nationalism in the region still.
Okay.
And people may disagree with me. I think when nationalism is continuously pumped into a society via the various mechanisms, whether it's football, whether it's national holidays and so forth, the fact that you have to continuously remind people of these things, it shows the fragility of the idea. The fragility of it means that then the state machinery has to continuously find ways of making sure that people don't abandon this idea. So we keep manufacturing ways of loving the nation because of the concern that, the nation might forget the love that it should have in that sense. When the Ottoman Empire collapses, one of the things that you see is that you don't see this obsession of people saying we are Ottomans. Okay. Even though Ottomanism as an idea emerges in the 19th century, there's not this obsession of having this way of thinking, this sort of like national consciousness. This is a very modern phenomenon. People would usually subscribe to saying, I'm from this city, I'm from that city, this is my religion, and so forth, right? It was far more generous. It was far more looser. And so in that sense, people didn't have to concern themselves with exhausting their emotional energies to showing their love for the nations that they were accidentally born in. Whereas now that needs to be pumped. Now, what's interesting for me is perhaps the wars in the region, like in Iraq, like in Syria, Yemen, Libya, perhaps Afghanistan, is those aggressive wars have to some degree destroyed the institutions of those nations and also destroyed the capacities and abilities of maintaining those, like a continuity of those ideologies, perhaps. In that sense, they have sped up the process of people having a more nuanced understanding of their national identities, perhaps. People will still say that I'm Iraqi, perhaps, but they will say, but I'm also. Where there was a time in the 50s and 60s and 70s where that may not have been the case. Now, I feel that the nation states in particular are trying to find ways of reinventing themselves as a way of trying to maintain and sustain their relevance. But on a human level, on the ground, I still feel that the idea hasn't become as deeply entrenched as people think. And Islam is a part of that. Globalization is another part of that. And just movement of people, migration, has created that sort of like complexity.
Yeah, and it's interesting you talk about how they have to keep pumping it in.
Yeah.
I mean, even we see that in the West in terms of kind of these riots recently. It was kind of instigated with this whole false claim about the murder of those young girls.
Yeah.
And it was just pushed on social media. It's very easy to agitate. But actually, is it really a deeply rooted idea? And it made me think, just out of interest, when the thing happened in Jordan on Sunday, in that Maher al-Jazi, the same people who had not been talking about Palestine seem to remember now, and it wasn't much. It was quite fickle, that idea of nationalism. It was almost withering away with just one action.
That's
and it made you think, what would happen if it was a substantial action?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think because I go back to Iqbal, he said, look, primarily, insan's love should be to love Allah Ta'ala. And I remember my Arabic teacher, he was Egyptian, Ahmed, he said to me, he goes, look, Yakoob, you love two entities. You love Allah Ta'ala, and then you love people for the sake of Allah Ta'ala because you love Allah Ta'ala. So in that sense, once you are of that thought process, and that is a thought process which even seeps into non-Muslims around you, in terms of understanding that your love is for the one that created you, then the sort of very superficial sort of like constructions of a very temporary notion of your state, I don't think is capable of sustaining that longevity. Now, Islam has proven for 1400 years that it has that longevity, and it will outlive even these modern, what I would call interregnum moments. Now, people may disagree with me once again because the idea of modernity is to believe that we are different than anyone else. But if history tells us anything, we're not different than anyone else. And the future might be very different.
And I've always felt that Palestine in particular and it was actually 1 week before 7th of October. I was having a discussion with some brothers, and it was about the Saudi normalization plans. And I said, Palestine will be the reason of Islamic unity.
Inshallah.
It will be the instigator.
Inshallah.
I'm not sure when that will happen,
Yeah.
but I feel it's been that awakening.
Yeah,
And
inshallah.
I would never have imagined what was going to happen in a week's time when I said that statement. But I always felt it, whether it was the other Gaza genocides, because they were not genocides, but certainly atrocities, and the other situations in terms of Aqsa, etc. So it was always kind of instigated that feeling in people.
Yeah, and you know, the whole idea of Bayt al-Maqdis and the region in particular has a very unique history regarding Islam. From the Islam Miraj of Rasul Sallam to, you know, the period of Umar ibn Khattab and Abu Ubaidah, radiallahu an, which people forget, to the point of the Umayyah, to Salahuddin, to the Ottomans, and even now. Okay, that this area, there's a reason why it's called Bayt al-Maqdis, in that sense. And so then Allah Ta'ala, in some ways, is safeguarding it in a way that He sees fit. And I think in that sense that it's always going to be instrumental in terms of instigating and influencing and inspiring the Ummah in some shape or form. It has to.
Yeah. I mean, there's one point that I think relates to this whole issue of unity and understanding the current nation-state model. I think a lot of thinkers and maybe academics look at this discussion and they say, well, it's just too far off. It sounds like a figment of your imagination. It's a dream. But is that because they've looked at this in the wrong way? Because one interesting thing I was reflecting on is when Medina was established, I mean, it started off in this very small, essentially city district, and it grew to encompass, as we know, so many lands. But even the Ottomans had something similar. The Ottomans were not the leaders of the Muslim world for many years, but it kind of had to initiate somewhere this concept that we're not going to be based on a nationality. We're not going to just be restrictive.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the idea of unity needs a proper, thorough examination. Maybe, you know, a proper sort of like intellectual conversation on this, because the assumption of unity is the very shallow assumption. Is we're just all going to agree on the price of bread. That's not the case, clearly. So unity, what do we mean here, right? And I think by and large, if you have a pluralistic ummah that have are from various different languages, various different backgrounds, ethnicities, cultures, and so forth, that's not what we mean when we say that they all have to be a homogeneous block. But they are unified, at least in standard, in terms of the orthodoxy of Islam. They have that principle. And so when there is an atrocity, that standard principle should evoke something in you enough to be so for all of you to collectively move. And that sort of movement cannot simply be done by the auspices of the masses. It needs to be led by people of leadership. And in that sense, that's why that matters. That you can't just expect people to just pull in one direction and just know to pull in that one direction. You know, you need leadership. But this is why it's there. In like I support Liverpool, right? And in the Champions League final, when Liverpool would beat AC Milan, Steven Gerrard, as the captain, stood up and pulled the team along with him. And everybody understood the vision. Everyone understood what he was trying to do. And they ran with him. Good leadership matters in that context. Look, the Brits do it all the time. They construct these imaginations of Churchill. Why? The Americans with Jefferson and Washington. Why do we construct these types of thinkers and leaders? There's a reason for that, because fundamentally human beings require it. They require an intellectual leadership, brave group of people who can lead people in particular directions. It's their objective to take the responsibility on behalf of the mass. In that sense, the unity is not established by the mass. It's established by the leadership. And the mass knows that we trust these people. They are competent, they are honest, and they adhere to the values that we belong to. Let's go with it. That's why that's important. And that's not rocket science. You know, I'm sorry to say to people who would tell me to be more pragmatic and so forth.
But I think that's the interesting part, because a lot of the time it's sold as being unrealistic because, how can you expect the leaders? We need to be unified. But how on earth are you going to achieve unity when we have no leadership?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, the Prophet ﷺ, through his life, he imbued leadership. He showed the Sahaba how to lead.
And I've said this all the time. I said, Rasul Sallam, When the Ummah laughed, he laughed. When the Ummah cried, he cried. When they were tortured, he was tortured. When they were at Badr, he was at Badr. He was there every step of the way, and he stood up and was counted. Even at Uhud, when he knew that, look, we need to think of a different strategy, he was still there because they're his people.
Yeah.
Right? He stood up for his people in that sense. So, look, I am of the thinking of, rather than critiquing the Ummah for having the desire and the ambition to want something different, and say, okay, look, we don't want to get into any more trouble, just park up a little bit. Say, look, okay, I will stand shoulder to shoulder with you. Let's do this. How do we do this? What are your thoughts? So that natural leaders emerge from the group and who naturally are captivating, and they can take the reins and people can follow. You have to give the Ummah that space to try to cultivate these thinkers. The only way you can do that is to allow them to think that, to allow them to believe that, to allow them to feel that. If at every moment you're going to curtail them in that process, then they're just not going to come about. So, and I guess 100 years of pragmatism tells us that. So in this sense, their concern is some crazies might emerge. I think the Ummah is smart enough, intelligent enough to know, that we don't even need to go down that radical extreme direction. Allow people to foster their sort of like natural abilities to lead rather than to just follow.
And you've got those historical examples as your guide, the Prophet ﷺ, as the ultimate guide, but even the Sahaba after him, the Rashidun, and then after that in some of the best periods of Islam. And it made me think of just this point of nationalism, just hit me, that during the Prophet ﷺ's life, he saw the potential flicker of nationalism and tribalism occurring. And as the leader, he put it out. And that's quite interesting, because we always say, oh, those Sahaba, they were on a different level. They're not going to be like us. But actually, they were about to fall into the same traps.
And even amongst the Sahaba, what's beautiful about Rasul is that he didn't fear the potential charisma or authority or leadership qualities in certain members of the Sahaba. Not all the Sahaba were like that, but there were certain Sahaba were like that, and he nourished that. He let them run with it because he was confident that after he would pass away, that these were the people that were going to take on the mantelpiece for Islam. And he was really adamant on sort of like investing in these people, in these Sahaba in particular, Sayyidina Abu Bakr, Umar and Ali ibn Talib and so forth, radiallahu anhum, because he knew that this is the future. And what people don't appreciate is when they became the Khulafa, it wasn't supposed to be perfect. That's not the point. Until the end of time, we're all going to be tested. That's the law of how life is. But they were standards of characters that we can look at and say, okay, you know what? That's what Islam demands from us in every shape or form.
That's an amazing point to think of that. He invested in them.
Absolutely.
These were going to be the future leaders. He wasn't going to just leave that to any old person. They had to be of that caliber.
And he loved them, which is beautiful. He didn't fear them. He didn't feel treachery from them. He didn't think they're going to stab him in his back. He loved them and they loved him. And that type of leadership quality and that type of leadership model is very unique. And that is something that is in our culture, and we know it, and we should be trying to encourage it.
I could probably ask 100 more questions, but I'm wary of time. But there was a couple of points that you raised in previous podcasts I really wanted to explore. Sure. One is we're going back on ourselves a little bit, Ottoman history. Yeah. I think you mentioned in one of the podcasts that the Battle of Vienna was a turning point in Ottoman history, where it started a period of decline.
That wasn't me.
Wasn't it you?
I would never
I've heard that somewhere else.
That is popular.
That is popular. Okay, so that I've heard it somewhere.
Yeah.
I don't know why that point has been made, and I just wanted to know from your perspective, where was then that period of decline? Because we know that people quote Sultan Abdul Hamid II as maybe the last great sultan in terms of trying to hold the state together under extremely difficult circumstances. Absolutely. But where was that period of decline?
So cyclical theories, by and large, which existed in all cultures and civilizational outlooks, was very prominent within the way that Muslims had done their history. And the issue of cyclical theories is it's still interpretive. You have to interpret the cycle that a group or a nation has gone through. Primarily, the cycle comes to an end when the entity ends. So people would look at the Ottomans as a 600-year cycle. That's how Muslims have interpreted it. Now, there is another conversation here. Are the Ottomans an anomaly where they have had a cycle for 600 years? Or are they close to what Ibn Khaldun talks about, which is that each state goes through a 120, 25-year cycle? If they are an anomaly, it's a unique anomaly. And so then the Battle of Vienna, which is perceived as the first main loss, in which the second Battle of Vienna, which is after Suleiman, is perceived as a loss where the Ottomans no longer expanded. And so that's from that moment onwards, people perceive it as a decline. Then that requires a 600-year interpretation of not just milestones, which is a very sloppy way of doing history. It requires real concrete complexity and so forth. Or one could argue that they continuously went through cyclical moments. The unique thing is that when they got to a combustion moment, they were able to reinvent themselves and go again. And there was no alternative competitor, so the Ottomans were able to continuously survive these cycles, right? If you look at it like that, then Vienna becomes irrelevant. Okay. Another point is that do states have to go through a cycle, or can they combust halfway? The reason why I'm explaining that is because contemporary Western academics are making the case that from the Tanzimat period onwards up until Abdul Hamid's period, the Ottomans were on an upward curve. And as they are on this upward curve, World War I happens, which is a contingency moment, which not only destroys the Ottomans, it destroys the Austrians, it destroys the Russians, and it destroys so many other empires in its wake. If we're looking at the cycle of the Ottomans, do we also need to look at the cycle of the Russians and the Austrians and so forth? An example, the British at the highest point in 1924, by 1947-48, the empire's gone.
Yeah.
That small gap. When did the decline begin for the British?
Yeah.
Right? Now, the Ottomans, which is interesting here, they were called the sick man of Europe by the Russians. And the Ottomans had called the British the sick man of Europe too.
Yeah, I heard
because of what was happening in India. The British had control over India in the late 1780s. But by the 19th century, the Ottomans are looking at the British and saying there's mutinies like the 1827 one and so forth. The British are not as strong as people think they are. Yes, they're taking territory from us and whatnot, but something is going on here, right? And then you've seen the emergence of Russia and so on. So cyclical theories, by and large, require a real level of what I would say investment and then analysis and so on. Most Muslims are not doing that. What they're doing is they're looking at it in terms of military campaigns and seeing that at its largest landmass in the 17th century, mid-17th century, so 1650s, 60s, the Ottomans had reached their zenith point in terms of expansion.
Okay.
And then after that, there was no more expansion, and it was a time of consolidation and regression. And so from that moment onwards, they will call it a decline moment. So they're purely looking at that. And the complexity here is that they equate the Ottoman Empire to Islam as a civilization. So whereas Khaldun initially is talking about just states themselves, here the idea is the Ottomans represent Islam in totality, which is unique. Why? Because look, when the Umayyads collapse, the Abbasids take on the mantelpiece. So the civilization continues. When the British collapse, the Americans take on the mantelpiece. So the civilization continues. It's the states that collapse. Whereas in the Ottoman case, when the Khilafah collapses, there's an assumption that no one else is taken over. So it's looked at in a very different purview than the ones that came before. The reason why I'm explaining all of this is to say that the analysis that Muslims are putting onto the table regarding this has been something which is part of a narrative, perhaps. And that narrative feeds into the idea that the reason why we were unable to compete with the European powers is because we were in decline and so forth. And then they will use key milestones and tropes as proof of that, devoid of any context and complexity. My argument would be is that was a moment, but by the 1730s and 40s, people, because they don't study Ottoman history, the Ottomans had defeated the Russians on many occasions in wars. actually 1774 and 1760 and 1774, the Ottomans were caught off guard when the Russians had defeated them, because for the whole earlier 18th century period, they were defeating the Russians.
Okay.
So sometimes these things can catch you off guard in that sense, but people are not recognizing that. The Tulip period in particular is seen as a period of real intellectual renaissance. The problem they have is we call it the paradox of war. The Napoleonic Wars that are taking place, when you're in war, the strange thing is there's a good opportunity of being hurt in war because loss of life, weapons and so forth. But the more you're in it, the more better you become at it. Whereas people who are not going to the gym, not going to war, they can become static. And then in comparison, 20, 30, 40 years later, they have fallen behind this entity which has been savaging itself. So even here, the complexity is this: does a state engage in warfare or not? Or should it engage in warfare or not? The Ottomans, when they were looking at the Western states going to war and savaging themselves, saw this as they're finished. We're in peacetime. We're doing okay. The Western states survived this in some shape or form and then become twice as savage in terms of the colonial projects as a way of surviving. And the Ottomans probably struggled to deal with that sort of like colonial activity. So I'm moving away from the decline paradigm a little bit, but just to try to explain that it's a thesis. But the thesis is often said in rhetoric, but no real studies proven on this. Now, for me, the thesis is irrelevant to some degree. I think what we have to look at is the Ottomans have collapsed. It is what it is. Now, okay, let's look at 1650s or 1667 or whatever it was, where the Ottomans started decline. And now it's 2024. So the argument is the Ummah have been in decline since then, up until today, right? In that sense. That is a very, very difficult proposition to put onto the table in that sense. And what's intriguing is some people would deny the nation-state period as a moment of decline, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's your viewpoint on this matter, isn't it?
Yeah, so it requires, in that sense, like I said, because it's interpretive, it requires some sort of like real analysis here. But because it's interpretive, it's neither here nor there, really, in some ways. But many people, when they do the meta-history, need those milestones of what you would call the timeline history. And so this was the moment where it began. But people forget, for example, in the 19th century, Sudan became part of the Ottoman Empire. Yemen, once again, became part of the Ottoman Empire.
So it's not so simple to say it was just a declining period. There were periods where...
Absolutely.
I mean, even I think about the example of, again, Abdulhamid II, that when I was in Jordan, you see the Othmani railway connecting all the way from Turkey to Medina, I believe it got to. You can see the tracks in Jordan. It's amazing. That project was done in 1911, I think, or 1907, 1908. I mean, you're talking just over 100 years ago. So even a feature project as big as that, infrastructure project as big as that was so successful. I was making a joke with people in Jordan that they call it Bas al-Sari'a, the fast bus in Jordan, from Amman to Zarqa, I think it was, or somewhere. Took longer and it still wasn't completed, while the Ottomanis had built the whole railway. An amazing comparison.
I mean, look, what's interesting is that people don't appreciate, perhaps, is that power is fragile. Okay, power needs to create a perception of strength. But in actuality, power can combust at any moment. October the 7th should tell us that you all, like the Israelis thought they were all high and mighty, the Americans thought we were, and then all of a sudden things start to unravel very quickly. And then you realize the fragility of power. Even in this country, COVID happens, all hell breaks loose. The reason why I'm explaining this is I want people to understand empire for a second. The ability to maintain power over empire. Because the only analogy I can give people is sometimes I tell them, you can't even maintain your own families. Understand what it means from Bosnia to Hadramaut to Algeria. That is huge. And for centuries. So in that sense, it's very easy sometimes to talk about, okay, here, like we're ticking boxes. But I want people to put themselves in this position and understanding. That's why I say the better question would be, how did they survive for so long? Right? How is that possible? Generationally, continuously, finding ways of surviving. Look, it's not perfect empire. And I think sometimes people think that I'm like an apologist for the Ottomans. No, I've just become the de facto Muslim who talks about Ottoman history. I actually teach Umayyad history and Abbasid history the same.
Oh, really?
Right? When I'm at university, all of it, because for me, it's all Islamic history.
Yeah.
And that's the point. When I teach Seljuk history, for example, I don't feel the need to try to debunk it, like to take it apart for the sake of it. I will show where there are problematic areas. We debate it with our students. They understand it. They know Muslims are not perfect, but we understand the canopy as a whole. And the Ottomans is the same for me, that I'm not going to abandon it as part of the Islamic tradition. They were Muslims and there were some issues here, but look at these areas here. Like, how did that work, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, as I said, so many areas that we'd love to explore, but there's one final question I'd like to ask today. It was again related to a point that you mentioned in the recent podcast. It was about the concept of Amr bil Ma'ruf Nahy al Munkar, doing good and forbidding evil. And you said it's kind of infused in the Muslim mindset in Islam. With today's struggle, what would your advice be to Muslims who want to be active in this arena, particularly in relation to Gaza, but I think more broadly speaking, as you said, in relation to the struggles that the Ummah and globally that humanity is facing? What would you advise them to engage in?
I think one of the hardest things that we have been struggling with is thinking in the capacity as a collective. We're still thinking in our capacities as individuals. Like the Quran, when it speaks to Muslims, it's speaking to us as a collective. Ya ayyuhal lazina amanu. It's not, talking. Sometimes we forget when we read the Quran, because the modern notion is like, it's about me. And even how I feel when I read the Quran. But you and I have been to Jummah khutbahs, especially in the region, where a khatib can rock the whole house. He will be reciting something in the Jummah khutbah, and everybody at that moment collectively resonates with what's being said. It's been said to all of us. And it's not being said to all of us as a sum of individuals. We now feel like a collective in that masjid at the time, in that sense. And that is the beauty of Islam, in that sense, that this idea of Amr bil Ma'ruf Nahy al Munkar is interesting. Why? One, because there's no hierarchy in this ayah. There's an expectation that everybody, every Muslim, no matter where they are in what cards life has given them, should try to do the best they can in terms of what is good and abstain from what is not. When that becomes the ethos of the way that you think and the way that you behave and so forth, then fundamentally you create as a collective a civilizational core that starts to manifest around. So, for example, in this country, I've always found that non-Muslims who know Muslims will always say, I know that guy is a nice guy. Generally, non-Muslims who dislike Muslims are the ones who don't mix with us. They have a distance in that sense. And this sort of like concept in Islam should be not only expected from us as individuals, but we have to expect it from every facet of our collective aspirations and activities, from leadership to the child we're teaching Islam to. It cannot be just expected that I'm going to do what's good. It's what we're going to do, which is good. What is our leadership going to do on our behalf, which is good? Those who represent us, that's what it is. Leadership is about representation in Islam. It's not about, that we make choices and you just follow. It's about you're representing us. There's a responsibility here. And we have agency in that conversation regarding representation, in that we have expectations from you. And so there should be an expectation of demanding from leadership that why are you not adhering to this principle? Because clearly you are not, right? So this is not just about me setting up a table outside, the high street and trying to do what's good and what's bad, or me trying to be the best son or the best husband. No, this is a concept which is expected in all of us. So we have to start expecting a collective responsibility. So when we go to the masjid on a Friday, we should be seeing ourselves as a collective. And I'll give you an example. I was listening to someone who said that when we became Muslim in the UK, we felt like the ethnic minority communities didn't take us seriously. And I said to them, because we're still a sum of individuals in the UK. We're not a community. And they went, what? Well, we don't use the word qawm or millah or ummah. We come together on a Jummah, maybe on Eid Salah, but we still, even if our neighbors are Muslim, we don't know them. That's not the same as when you're in the Muslim world. I know that because I lived there. It's different, right? So that collective responsibility of encouraging people to think as a collective, of taking responsibility over each other. So when you're in an organization, to learn to be responsible. And those who are in positions where they are being encouraged to be responsible on behalf of other people, they need to adhere to this principle. So this is why historically what I noticed is throughout the Muslim world, this principle, and then I said the ayah in the Quran, in the Jummah khutbah, right? Basically what they did is they infused and created a culture of civility amongst the Muslims. And yes, there was leadership and there was the ulama, but the Ummah also took responsibility. It saw itself as being responsible agents in this conversation. And, like you'll hear stories of the Muslims went to Imam Malik and asked him to do this on their behalf. The Muslims went to Al-Shafi'i and told him, can you do... That means that the community itself took a responsibility of that which is good and abstaining with that which is not at all times for all peoples, right? So for me, I think that's important. I don't know what you think.
No, I think that's a really important point. And one thing from my experience, being kind of very active on social media, and I find that people tend to, I talked about this, gravitate towards what is generally accepted. Yeah. So, for example, many media platforms, they'll post a picture of a distressed child or another house that's been bombed, and it will just say something like Israeli genocide. And I think, okay, as much as that's useful in terms of spreading the word that there is a genocide going on, I think no one can avoid the fact that we know a genocide is happening now. Surely the Amr bil Ma'ruf wa Nahy Munkar needs more from us.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, for example, I was in Jordan in about April, May, and some people said, "Oh, don't say anything when you're in Jordan. You can't say anything." Well, I said, "No, I'm not going to be a hypocrite. I'm not going to say it in the UK, and then as soon as I'm in Jordan, I turn off." Yeah. And I encountered family members who were being a bit nationalistic, or I encountered taxi drivers or other people, and I was like, "Hang on, I'm not going to allow this." Islam has given me the tools to say this isn't our deen. We've got a much higher value. We need to be calling to that. So I see Amr bil Ma'ruf wa Nahy Munkar at that level as well. But I think it's very interesting when you see it just as an individual. You're right. It becomes nothing more than, okay, I need to pray. I need to tell my kids to pray. But actually, there's a community out there. There's a humanity out there. I mean, if the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba had that mentality, it would have been stuck in a few houses in Mecca and we would have stopped.
Look, let's be honest. When Gaza first kicked off, I said this in a presentation in Turkey. I said, these are my children. These are my sisters. This is how it is. Like, you need to understand this right now. These are not Palestinians. This is my family. This hurts me. And it's painful. And, I see for all our failings, for all our issues, these are my people. When people ask me, like, how have you survived in Turkey for 10, 11, 12 years? Like, so these are my people. Irrespective. It doesn't matter. My people, just like me, are not perfect, but they're still my people. And I see them as that. And I that's why I invested in that. And at no point do I see my investment as a failure. Not because I feel like I achieved something, but because I did everything I could in my power to try to help my people, and I'll continue to do that until I die.
I love that. My people.
Yeah, absolutely.
It goes beyond any nationality.
Yeah, absolutely.
It goes beyond any colour, race, ethnicities.
I've never, I mean, people might think that I'm just saying this to blow my own trumpet. I've never differentiated between my students. I think being an educator, alhamdulillah, gave me the opportunity to recognize how much I care for this ummah. I quoted in one of the podcasts about Hadith Jibreel. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but what I loved about Hadith Jibreel in the, Imam Nawawi's Hadith Qudsi, it's the second Hadith, is the fact that Jibreel alayhi salam closes his distance between him and Rasul sallam. He loved Rasul sallam. He's, and of course he did. But he sits with him knees to knees. There is an importance here of understanding that there's a muhabba between the two, between the messenger of messengers and Rasul sallam, to the point that he closed the gap. But this activity, not just the Q&A between the two of them, but the physical activity, was for all people to see. Close the distance. Close the distance between those that you love, between teacher and student. And if you read the hadith carefully, you get the essence that Rasul Sallam closed the distance between him and Umar bin Khattab when he speaks to him. In fact, writing, which is the beauty of writing in Quran, is it, you know, when you think about it, the hikmah of Allah Ta'ala in terms of it being a kitab, is that distance is closed in writing in a way that even a podcast format can't close. This conversation, we might watch it on the screen, we might hear it, but there's something about when you're reading that it closes the distance. And when you're reading that hadith, Rasul Sallam is not just teaching of Jibreel alayhi salam, the people in the space. He's teaching me, the reader, because I feel like I'm a participant here. I feel like I'm one of the people who's sitting in the audience and seeing what's happening. In that sense, my point is that we have to go back to particular traditional practices of closing the distance between us. Because what modernity has created is a comfortability of having that distance, of not knowing your neighbor, of not needing to be uncomfortable when talking to people, of going in the metro and not speaking to anyone, of going in a coffee shop and putting on your headphones, walking down the street, people will put their headphones on, watching something on your phone, at the dinner table, watching a movie. Everything is about not knowing your neighbor, this is not what Islam encourages.
But that's kind of the character you need to be the one who is amongst your community, a leader in your community.
Absolutely.
To command good and forbid evil.
When elections happen, what do they do? They come knocking on everyone's doors. Why? Because they want people to, I'm here for you. I'm your local MP. They're trying to close the distance between them and the people. Why should I vote for you? Because I knocked on your door. This is who I am, and so on. There's a recognition here that still the tradition of the human component, which makes us human, needs to be done, right?
Just an interesting hadith as well. When you said that, it made me think of another example. The time that a young man came to the Prophet ﷺ to ask him for permission to commit zina. It's a famous hadith. And I read the full narration, and I used it in a khutbah. He comes in and he says, give me permission to commit zina. And the Sahaba say, go away. Like, what are you asking?
Yeah, that's right.
Prophet ﷺ calls him to him, and he says he puts his hand on him. And I gave that example, but that is a leader on every level.
Yeah.
He wasn't going to let him get away with it or let him kind of ruin his life, but he was going to give it to him in the way that was going to connect.
Not
by
only
touching him and by saying the famous example, would you want this with your own sister,
Absolutely.
your own mother? He made him see the mirror and say, actually, well, what am I calling for? I'm calling the destruction of society.
So I think it was during the Battle of Badr as well, right? Where Umar bin Khattab, these kids come in and he says, like, how many are on the opposite side? It's either Badr or Uhud, somebody can correct me.
Yeah.
And then Rasul Sallam goes, because Umar slaps the kids about a little bit, Rasul Sallam calls it, what are you doing?
I didn't know that one.
Pulls the kid over and then sits him down and then says, how many camels do they have?
And when they work out.
And they say they have 10 camels. And they say, okay, 100 people in one camel.
That's right, that famous way of working out.
What you realize, one should appreciate when studying Seerah, this is why Seerah is important. So I was spending some time with Malik al-Badri. He was, rahimahullah, he passed away. He was from Sudan, and he was writing a book on how Allah Ta'ala tests Anbiya. And he and I were having this wonderful conversation before he passed away. And one of the things he said was that Rasul Sallam had tremendous emotional intelligence, which we sometimes don't see in the hadith literature because we just bypass that. He said, but if you read hadith literature properly, you will see it, and because you especially see in Seerah, is his emotional sort of like intelligence.
It's amazing.
And that emotional intelligence is there because Amr bin Ma'ruf and Nahy anil Munkar means you fundamentally care for that other person like they're your own. You don't only want good for you, you want good for everyone. And so you close the distance between you and the person you're giving da'wah to. Yeah. Because you fundamentally are interested in everyone's salvation. In that sense, this is what I think, I think it was Taha Abdul Rahman, the Moroccan philosopher and scholar, he recently said that when you read Seerah, Rasul Sallam himself is an ayah. He's a sign for you to contemplate over about how to be the perfect human being. Right? Right. Now, you're not going to be the perfect human being, but you're aspiring to that. So when we were talking about leadership before and ideals and values, but Islam encourages you to aspire to being the one who is the symbol for all of us. Right? This is who he is. In that sense, you should be ambitious in trying to be the best Muslim you can be. So when we spoke about Amr bin Ma'ruf and Nahy anil Munkar again, you can't just say this is sufficient, because the concept is that you don't know if it's sufficient. So you got to keep on moving to be better. So I'm clearly saying, I'm not denying this, and I include myself in this. What we're doing right now is insufficient. So clearly we should be aspiring that how can we be better? That doesn't simply mean that, I'm going to be talking only about politics. And so it's like on every level, that look, I have something to offer here. I'm trying to be the best version of me. We are trying to be the best version of ourselves as a community, as a collective. And we now have something to say.
Yeah.
And I think that's important.
I think that's amazing. I'll just end on a point about reflecting on that point about Gaza.
Yeah.
On so many levels, we've seen them kind of raise the bar.
Absolutely.
In terms of how they deal with each other as families, as communities, cooking for each other, resisting occupation, being, this samud, this kind of fortitude, this resilience.
Yeah.
So you're right. Islam crosses all those elements. It's not kind of like restricted to politics, restricted to family. It's something we need to really kind of wholeheartedly take on.
Well, Gaza blew me away
because
you're looking at a child who's going through a war zone and then she's reading Quran. Then you're looking at that and you're thinking to yourself, okay, wait a minute. If that's the standard, now we're looking at a particular standard here. The standard is not how much money I have. The standard is not, me being from the United Kingdom. The standard is not me being, I don't know, whatever. That is the standard. The standard is Iman and Taqwa. The standard is that they are not asking Allah Ta'ala anything apart from, have we done what is sufficient for you?
I keep saying it.
That is just mind-blowing.
It is completely.
It's not like, Ya Allah, give me this. It's, have what we done sufficient for you?
Mm-hmm.
They're saying things like, if you took one of my child, if the second child is for you, then so be it. That type of understanding as a collective means that the type of activity that was taking place was on such a human level that it was inculcated in all of them, if not the majority of them.
Yeah.
And that created a particular culture that's manifest.
It's probably the only place in the world we've seen it to that degree.
Absolutely. Right? Well, that I've seen.
I
haven't seen
and
it.
I even say to people very respectfully, the West Bank isn't the same. And people say, I'm just saying, Gaza is on another level of special. You have to understand that.
And the fact that they are trying to tear that down should not be permitted, one. But it also should not be permitted in the sense that if they think they're successful in tearing it down, we're going to create more of those.
Yeah.
And we're going to create them everywhere. And now what you're going to do? That should be the mindset, right? So that's, in that sense, like Rasulullah was a magnet. People were drawn to him wherever he went. And I think that this is what we should be doing right now. And I hold myself accountable to that. I really do. I'm not going to lie to you. I was in a cafe the other day and I was listening to two Muslims talking about the Tottenham and Arsenal game. And they went in such detail. And I was just sitting there just going, this is not even important. Now, for some of your listeners, I granted, I'm not, people can't watch football and so forth, but I was in an emotional state at the time where I was just thinking to myself, I don't know how much time I now have for this stuff.
That's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because it's made us reevaluate our lives.
Yeah, absolutely.
And subhanAllah, my boys both love football.
Yeah.
So they were talking about the Arsenal-Tottenham game.
Right.
And my son comes to me and he'll always say to me something interesting about sports. And I'll say, what about Gaza? And I'll just say that. And then he goes, like you've hurt me a bit.
Yeah.
But I said, I don't mind.
Yeah.
Because I just need to put it into perspective.
Yeah.
Look, no one's saying, as you said, you can't do any of these things, but where's our priorities in life?
Absolutely.
Especially now when we've seen what we've seen in the last year.
And that's why I said earlier on about the need for collective reflection. We can see this, that we are being tested by Allah Ta'ala. Or we can see this as an opportunity moment. That yes, just after Uhud, where the Muslims felt a sense of distress in terms of what had happened. And Allah Ta'ala had said to them, look, I know what's in your hearts. I know that you have remorse and it's okay. That we take this and say, Ya Rab, we failed. But you know what? From this moment onwards, I want to try to think differently. I want to try to be a different human being. I may fail still. I may still fall off, but from this moment onwards, I no longer want to be the person I was prior to October the 7th. Okay. And I say that with, like, no disrespect to the atrocities that happened to Muslims around the world prior to that. That really hurt me. But something's happened here where it's created another shift in me. And I don't think I could go back to being that same person. And this is why I said, look, it's time for us to be a bit more braver in upholding the truth. Because it's not just the Ummah that are being held to ransom here. The truth is being held to ransom.
I think that's an amazing point to finish off on, an amazing kind of advice. And I think a lot of people echo your feelings, but inshallah it'll be a motivation for others. Jazakallah khair.
Thanks for having me. And I just want to say one more thing. Like, if I've said anything to offend anyone or you guys or so forth, my apologies for that. It's just, like I said, that my people, I care about you as much as I care about myself.
Alhamdulillah. No, Jazakallah khair.
Barakallah feek.
Okay, assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.